Good morning and welcome to our Bible study. I hope everyone is doing well. We are continuing our Bible study on Matthew, and we are in chapter 23, so let's get started. Matthew 23. Then Jesus said to the crowd and to his disciples, "The teachers of the law and the Pharisees sit in Moses' seat. So you must be careful to do everything they tell you, but do not do what they do, for they do not practice what they preach. They tie up heavy, cumbersome loads and put them on other people's shoulders, but they themselves are not willing to lift a finger to move them. Everything they do is done for people to see. They make their phylacteries wide and tassels on their garments long. They love the place of honor at banquets and the most important seats in the synagogues. They love to be greeted with respect in the marketplaces and to be called rabbi by others. But you are not to be called rabbi, for you have one teacher, and you are all brothers. And do not call anyone on earth Father, for you have one Father, and he is in heaven. Nor are you to be called instructors, for you have one instructor, the Messiah. The greatest among you will be your servant. For those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted." And so what we have here is Jesus, we're continuing to move to the cross, and really the message is getting more and more intense, and in a sense you see Jesus really going after religious leaders, going after I'm going to say a religious spirit that kills and destroys, and that's what he's trying to make distinctions of. Yes, it's great for us to gather and together as a people of God to worship, and Methodism. There's some wonderful things about it, but when the denomination, when the setup, when the leadership becomes the focus of church events, of church activities, of calling this the mission of God instead of the true mission of God, and going out into all the world making disciples, you're losing track. It's years and years ago I heard a story. I think it's one of the district superintendents was at a church conference and told the story of a town in Upper East Coast that decided to, because there were so many shipwrecks in the area, they decided to build a building for the sailors that they would pick up to bring back and receive warmth and get dry clothes, get their clothes washed and dried, to get medical attention. And so it was kind of like an emergency setting. And so as the year goes, they bring in the sailors, they take care of them. But somehow along the way, it got to the point as they started taking care of the building that they didn't want sailors to go into the building that were wet and dirty and maybe were sick and injured, and they didn't want to get mud and blood and anything on the floors or the walls of their new building. And so it became a building that was kind of like a monument. And I think this is what that story is getting at, what Jesus is talking about here, that somehow, some way, in this religious system, the focus on a relationship with God, on making disciples, has disappeared, and somehow the leadership has lost focus. And this is what Jesus is calling the folks on the carpet about. You have lost focus on the mission of God. And so he says, folks, you need to be careful about the leadership in the church. They might... They like this. It's kind of like if you remember Genesis chapter 1, when sin came in, or chapter 1 through 3, a little bit of 4, God told Adam and Eve, here's what's going to happen because this curse, the curse of sin, has come in. And one of the curses was that the woman would bend towards the man instead of bend towards God in worship. And the curse for the man was that he would like that. And I see a bit of this popping out as well, that that some of the teachers, the leaders of the church, they began to enjoy this this worship, so to speak. We've all probably had some pastors in our life that we like. He or she was the best person ever, and there's nobody that can replace them. And and we lean towards, sometimes we can worship these people because they just meant so much at a very difficult time, and it's okay for them to mean something, but when we move into worship, that becomes a problem for you, obviously, false worship, and it becomes a problem for the pastor as well. It's so tempting to win and want the accolades, and so Jesus is warning against that, and saying that there are some people in church, that's their intent. They don't care anything about a relationship with God. They like the pats on the back. They like the success stories. They like to look the part and be successful and be honored in public. And they're going after honor for themselves instead of honoring God. And Jesus is just giving those examples there. Now, the rest of the chapter here is, my Bible has the 7 woes on teachers of the law and the Pharisees, and so we're going to address that, the woe to you, and that's we think of that as more of a religious term, but in Jesus' time, woe to you is kind of shame. It's an attention grabber. This is very serious, and you need to take what I'm saying very seriously. As he says, a woe. It's almost this is a curse that can come your way if you accept it. And I think it's almost his last-ditch effort to minister to the Pharisees, Sadducees, or last warning, and to speak to what we'll call the common folk of the church. As you need to be careful of teachers and Pharisees and Sadducees. Certainly there are lots of good leadership in the church, but don't just assume. There needs to be some testing, and Paul goes into a little more detail about that as we'll encounter his letters later. But we don't just because they look the part, we don't assume they are that person. There's some testing that needs to go on. So verse 13 here says, "Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You shut the door of the kingdom of heaven in people's faces. You yourselves do not enter, nor will you let those enter who are trying to." And so here's our first woe. And again, this is Jesus, I would say, attacking false leadership within the church. And so, woe to you, teachers of the law, you Pharisees, you hypocrites. And so he's kind of giving them some titles here, teachers and teachers of the law, the Pharisees. And he said, my title for you is hypocrite. And that's a Greek word, two-faced. Two faces. You put on the mask. It's like putting on the mask on Sunday or during church time, and you're quite a different person outside of the public spotlight. And so you pretend to be this person, but the reality is your actions show who you really are, and you have no interest in heaven, and you have no interest in anybody getting into heaven. And so you put on the face, but you have no interest in their lives. You have no interest in their salvation. Matter of fact, your actions they portray the fact that you're trying to keep people out of that. And we see that even today in modern Christianity, that the false teachings that are going out throughout our church continue to this day, and these teachings will keep people from discovering the real Jesus. Verse 15, woe to you, teachers of the law and the Pharisees, you hypocrites. So he's saying the same thing again. You travel over land and sea to win a single convert, and when you have succeeded, you make them twice as much a child of hell as you are. And I think he's just laying out, here's the characteristic of a hypocrite in leadership. They claim to want to go out into all the world and make disciples, and you hear even in our leadership now that when some challenge some biblical principles, they still come, our job is to make disciples. But what kind of disciples? There's a question we need to ask. What kind of disciples are you making? Are you making them Christian disciples? Or are you making, is there some other religion? And that's, I think, what Jesus is bringing up here. You talk about this, and you'll spend a whole lot of money. And hadn't we had this before? Send us some money so we can go on these mission trips. So you'll travel over land, over sea to win one person, but you're winning a convert, not to one who enters into a relationship with God, but your convert. And you make them twice as much a child of hell. And so what he's saying is, you false teachers, preachers, you're preaching hell, not heaven. So verse 16, what are you blind guides? So he's still talking about these Pharisees. You say, if anyone swears by the temple, it means nothing, but anyone who swears by the gold of the temple is bound by that oath. You blind fools, which is greater, the gold or the temple that makes the gold sacred? You also say, if anyone swears by the altar, it means nothing, but anyone who swears by the gift on the altar is bound by that oath. You blind men, which is greater, the gift or the altar that makes the gift sacred? Therefore, anyone who swears by the altar swears by it, and by everything on it. And anyone who swears by the temple swears by it, and by the one who dwells in it. And anyone who swears by heaven swears by God's throne and by the ones who sit on it. And so here, to some extent, this is obviously a making an oath to God, and I think there's more to it than this. It's what's important to you, and it's almost like you're making trivial things sacred, and the things that were intended to be sacred you're trivializing, and Jesus is saying, woe to you that you get so out of kilter that you don't understand the important things of that God has called important. It's kind of like my first years of ministering. I remember when some children started to come to the church. They didn't know how to act, and they hadn't quite been taught how to, or learned how to wipe their feet when they come into the building, and it caused some problems to the point where people were considering saying, let's not invite these kids to come to church because they're making our carpets so dirty, and it takes us hours to clean the carpet. And that thinking can get off kilter pretty quickly for us if we're not careful. And this is what Jesus is talking about. Yep, I'd love to keep our carpet clean all the time, but I would rather have a dirty carpet and clean hearts than I would nobody in the building and a clean carpet. And that's, I think, to me, a part of what Jesus is getting at here. Where is the focus in terms of offering? It's not the gold, it's where the gold is placed. Where the gold is put. If a church raises millions of dollars and they just do it for building improvements and not for the gospel, so what? And that's not to say that we can improve our buildings. Obviously, we need to maintain our buildings, and we do want them to look pretty. But our focus is not on fresh paint, clean carpet. It's on the mission of the church. All right, verse 23. Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You give a tenth of your spices, mint, dill, and cumin, but you have neglected the more important matters of the law, justice, mercy, and faithfulness. You should have practiced the latter without neglecting the former. You blind guides, you strain out the gnat, but swallow the camel. Here again, Jesus is questioning focus. And I do want us to notice here at the end is like you focus on these little things, giving a tenth of your spices, and I think he uses spices because when you think about it, our spices come in little bitty bottles like this. It's just a little bit of amount, and here you are focusing on the detail of making sure a tenth of that goes to God, when there are much bigger issues here of justice and mercy and faithfulness, and so. Quit putting all of your attention on some little things that in the end aren't going to matter that much, and make sure you take care of the big things first. And now again, I want us to notice here at the end of verse 23, it says you should have practiced the latter without neglecting the former. And so I think he's getting there. He's like, I know what some of you is going to do. You're going to say, well, Jesus said we don't ever have to give a tithe, because that's not, worrying about the 10th thing is not a big deal to him. And he's saying right here, no, you should practice the latter, but without neglecting the former, without neglecting, definitely practice the law of justice, mercy, and faithfulness. But don't neglect the tithing. That's a part of our faith walk as well. And so keep that in mind. And it's really interesting because I think this is a very intense time. I mean, this seems very forceful sermon here. And he's really going after people. He's not worried about feelings here. He's, I'm going to say, on the attack. But right here's a pause. Verse 24, you blind guides, which is true. I mean, I could see that forcefully coming out. You strain out a gnat, but you swallow a camel. And that's a bit of humor that he's putting in there. This is a dad joke here. Gnat and camel are very similar words, and so they rhyme in the original language. And so there would be some chuckles that would come out of this. And I think Jesus is understanding that this is intense. There's a lot of emotions probably coming out here, a lot of hurt, anger, and maybe fear that as we begin to evaluate ourselves under these things that he's saying. And it's almost like Jesus said, all right, take a breath. You need to hear this, and this is for your own good, but I'm not doing this to annihilate you. I'm doing this to push you, forcefully push you in the right direction. It's kind of almost like a child. I can remember when my kids were little one time as we were crossing the road, I saw a car come. One of my kids was not moving as fast as they needed to get across the road safely, and so I forcefully pushed or pulled. I don't remember exactly, and then I can remember on the other side of the road the kids not liking what I did to get them across the road. And I didn't do that because I hated them. I did it because I loved them, and I didn't want them to get hit by a vehicle. I wanted them to get to the other side of safety. And I think this is what Jesus is doing here, even though this is in some extent an attack on false beliefs, on hypocrites. Okay, let's move forward here. Verse 25. Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You clean the outside of the cup and the dish, but inside they are full of greed and self-indulgence. Blind Pharisees! First clean the inside of the cup and dish, and then the outside also will be clean. And so Jesus, again, giving some imagery here of, what is clean. Just because you can dress up all you want, but the fact is you're sick and you need a physician. I can remember visiting some folks in the hospital, and that I knew that they were really sick, but you go in and sometimes, probably in your visitations, you've noticed people will put on a face, oh, I'm not so bad, everything's okay, and we know that that's not true, that there's things that need to be fixed. Now, they might put it on for us, but sometimes they put it on for the doctors too, and then the doctor doesn't get the information they need to really help the person. And so these lies are hurtful, and part of this is Jesus says, stop pretending. You can play the role all you want, but if it's not going on in your heart, you don't have it yet. And so stop fooling yourself, stop fooling others, and get real. Okay, verse 27, woe to you, teachers of the law and the Pharisees, you hypocrites. Again, this forceful language. You are like whitewashed tombs, which look beautiful on the outside, but on the inside are full of bones of the dead and everything unclean. In the same way, on the outside you appear to be people of righteousness, but on the inside you are full of hypocrisy and wickedness. I can't help but think of some Old Testament imagery here, where Elijah God was talking to him about this, there's some people in the temple, they come out and they preach, but when they go back into their inner office, they're as wicked as can be, and they're actually worshiping false gods. And here's Jesus attacking this, pretending again, and he's basically, here you're full of death. I mean, you can put all you want on the outside. You can get a facelift 100 different times, but the fact is, you're old, and there's going to be some wrinkles. And quit pretending. Quit trying to fool people into thinking you're something you're not. And he's going after the wickedness. Stop hiding it, and go after it. And let me take it. Again, this is very forceful. What imagery it is here to say you're dead. Don't you understand? You can put on all the makeup you want. You can clean up all you want, but the reality is you're dead. Okay, verse 29. Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You build tombs for the prophets and decorate the graves of the righteous, and you say, if we had lived in the days of our ancestors, we would not have taken part with them in shedding the blood of the prophets. So you testify against yourself that you are the descendants of those who murdered the prophet. Go ahead then and complete what your ancestors started. And again, he's speaking to church leadership, church people. You can pretend all you want, and you can say, I'm a Wesleyan. I follow, as us Methodists, I follow the teachings of John Wesley. But folks, I got to tell you, there's some things that's going on in the Methodist Church that John Wesley would be quite livid about, and we can proclaim that he's our forefather. He's the one that it's his teachings that form the basis of our faith, and how we react to our faith and how we worship God. But we can lift him up all we want, but if we don't truly abide by the things that God showed him, this is false, and that's why he's getting at it. So some of you leaders there, you're saying, I'm a Wesleyan, or I'm a Calvinist, or whatever, and you're not even abiding by the teachings that these men received. And you can proclaim that all you want, and John Wesley said some profound things, absolutely. And we can repeat the things that he said, but if we don't believe them, we're false teachers, we're hypocrites. And so he's like, stop it. Just stop it. This is stupidity. But at the same time, go ahead. You go ahead and do that. Then you can proclaim all you want, but the reality is you're not that. You're nowhere near what these folks did in the uniting with my Holy Spirit. All right, verse 33, you snakes, you brood of vipers. We can't get much stronger than this, can we? How will you escape being condemned to hell? This is tough. Therefore I am sending you prophets and sages and teachers. Some of them you will kill and crucify. Others you will flog in the synagogues and pursue from town to town. And so upon you will come all the righteous blood that has been shed on earth, from the blood of righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah, son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the temple and the altar. Truly I tell you, all this will come on this generation. And so he's speaking to the present generation that he's with here. It's like, again, all of this pretending, but here's the reality. You're a snake. You are vipers. You are the most poisonous people I've encountered. Isn't that something that, dear God, never say that about me, never say that about you. And yet there's this little hope out there. He says, how will you escape being condemned to hell? I read in this, not that he's already condemned them, but they still have breath in their lungs, and they still have a chance to escape hell, even though they are a brood of vipers. They are snakes. And he gives examples. He said, you're just like the people in the Old Testament. They went after God's prophets, and you're doing the exact same thing. You can say, I wouldn't have done that, but the reality is you're doing it right now. Matter of fact, we're getting that here in verse 37. Let me read that. Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you who kill the prophets and stone those who sent to you. How often I have longed to gather your children together as hens gather her chicks under her wings, and you were not willing. Look, your house is left to you desolate, for I tell you, you will not see me again until you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. And Jesus is referring to the Psalms there, of course. But again, to go back to close out our thought, you brood of vipers, he said, you're doing the same thing the folks in the Old Testament, the stories of these bad characters. You say, I would never do that. He said, well, you're doing it. You are rejecting God. You are rejecting his prophets. You are rejecting his truth. And Jesus ends, to me, this is a prayer of his heart, Jerusalem, Jerusalem. And matter of fact, if you go back to the original language, I think here Matthew was trying to communicate this to us, that Jesus is crying. He's not, and maybe it's an anger cry. It certainly could be from all that we've read, but there's so much emotion in this writing here, and particularly in this part. And I hope you can capture this as we're reading this. Jerusalem, Jerusalem. So it's a wailing over Jerusalem. You who kill the prophets and stone those sent to you. How often I have longed, and here this is Jesus, how often I have longed to gather your children together. And then here again, now think about this. This is Jesus saying, I was a part of this Old Testament. These people that I talked about, the prophets that were sent in Old Testament times, I sent them. How often I have longed to gather your children together as a hen, and the imagery there as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings. I want to protect you. Quit rejecting me. The storm is coming. Come under my wings. Because he knows what's going to happen in this storm. If you don't get under the shelter of his wings, you will die. You will be eliminated. And so how I long, and again, the idea in the original language, it's all that he's speaking this out, and there's almost like stops in the writing. It's sort of like somebody going, how often I have longed And so, there's such intensity here that I'm desperate for you. I hope you see the love in this. As forceful as this chapter is, this is full of an anger that desires the best for his children. It's not an anger of destruction. I hear a lot of people say that anger is really just fear, as a different type of expression of fear. Now, God doesn't fear, but he certainly knows our emotions, and here I think we're seeing his heart, just desperate for us to come under his wings. Look, your house is left to you desolate. And he said, look at your life. Sit back and really look at your life. Your life without me is desolate. I mean, that is total destruction. For I tell you, you will not see me again until you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. And there's a promise that, when the Lord comes back, every knee shall bow, every tongue confess. Whether people have rejected or not, every person will say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. We will recognize the reality that Jesus is our King, our Lord, our Savior, or for those who rejected, our Judge. Okay, we'll stop here. We'll take a breath after this intense time in our chapter here, and look forward to being with you next week. God bless. Take care. Peace of Christ.